All right, thanks, Kevin, for that information. So, yeah, so based on those inventories and what you might be needing, if you're in need of some forage early on in the season, or projecting out if you need something later in the fall, those are doing that inventory is really critical in figuring out where you're sitting as far as current inventory, projecting out what your forage inventory usage is, or forage usage is, so that you can then figure out what do you actually need to be growing as far as quality and yield to fill that inventory for the next year. So a couple of the forages I'll be going through are cereal grain forages and sorghum forages that we've been working with. And Joanna will cover a few other ones that are becoming a bit more common as well. So first off, we'll go through cereal grain forages. These are fairly common, and a lot of producers are very familiar with growing these, especially oats and rye and triticale. More and more folks are using these either in a fall planted and spring harvest situation, say after corn silage or soybeans, or if they're putting these in spring planting and then an early summer harvest. So producers are pretty familiar with using these. And really depends on, like last year, we obviously didn't get a lot of these fall planted late spring, fall planted winter cereals in, just due to late crop harvest and soil conditions. So there's not a lot of those put in at this put in the ground or growing. So I think a lot of folks this year are probably gonna have to go with the spring planted cereal grains if they're looking at this as an option. And they're definitely doable, especially oats or spring barley are two good options that have shown good quick yields in spring, especially if you're needing forage fairly quickly. Typical yields are going to be, especially at boot stage, they're going to be 1 to 2 tons of dry matter if you're looking for high quality lactating cow feed. If you're in need of other a bit lower quality forages, say for heifers, you could extend that out a bit and get some more tonnage and a little bit less quality in that case. As far as different species, so triticale is generally going to mature a bit slower than rye in the spring. And so if you're looking at that, especially at fall planting and spring harvest, that triticale has become a bit more popular because it's a little bit more forgiving as far as that spring harvest, if you're especially if you're concerned about weather conditions. I don't want you to also forget there's good options in the late summer as well. So planting in early August, putting in oats has shown to be a good option if you need tonnage at the end of the season. Wayne Colbins has some good data on that, and typical yields are going to be between 1 to 3 tons of dry matter with very good digestible fiber content and high sugars. So that's another very good option out there as well. So if we look at some yield data from Marshfield at winter triticale, these are from 2016 in the blue bars and 2017 in the red bars. But at boot stage, and we've been getting about 1 to 2 tons of dry matter, but it can be highly variable depending on weather conditions. So in 2016, we had about 3,000 pounds of dry matter, or about 1.5 tons of dry matter per acre. But if you look at the boot stage in 2017, it was significantly less, about half that. So again, that was due to soil conditions. It was a much wetter year in 2017. If you decide to delay harvest of triticale or rye in the spring, your tonnage can very quickly increase with heading and flowering up to 3 to 4 tons of dry matter per acre in a good year in a bit poor year, say in 2017, or even at soft dough, we were only at about 2 to 2.5 tons of dry matter per acre. So it's can be very variable depending upon growing conditions. If we start looking at quality, if we look at NDF with the blue bars at different plant maturities, you can see obviously as it becomes more mature, you get higher fiber levels in that crop, and then as those fiber levels increase, the energy or TDN levels will decrease. Fairly simple standard across all of our forages. If we want to look at specifically lactating cows or younger heifers, we're targeting right around 65% TDN for those animals. So again, we're going to target this boot stage for harvesting it for them. If we're wanting to look for more heifer feed, we could definitely look at harvesting it later, get higher tonnage at heading or flowering stage would be an ideal stage to be harvesting it. You can harvest at soft dough, but you can run into some issues with harvesting that with the packing densities, with the hollow stems. It can become difficult getting that packed adequately with having to chop that a bit finer. Incorporation of the diets of these cereal forages is, you can get pretty good amount of forage, and this is from 2 different farms in Dane and Brown County in a recent project. If you can see that the rilage in farm 1 was about 17% of the dry matter, and farm 2 is about 8%, but both of them are right around 15 to 20% of the forage in those diets. And then the milk production was again maintained fairly high at 90 to 95 pounds of milk per cow for those herds. So these forages can be used in lactating cow diets when they're harvested at that boot stage to get the high quality. Now we're going to move on to sorghum forages, switch gears a little bit. So these are going to be warm season annuals grown. So they definitely require a fair amount of heat to grow these and proper management. There's 3 different types of these. We have forage sorghum. That's going to be fairly similar to growing corn silage. It's going to be a single harvest system, gets fairly tall, 6 to 12 feet tall, depending on the varieties. Sorghum Sudan or Sudan grass, it's a little bit more flexible in terms of the harvest management. You can do multiple harvests from 2 to 3 harvests for lactating cows. It may be possible. In Wisconsin, it's likely only going to be about 2 because we're limited on degree days later in the season. Or if you're looking for heifers, a single harvest system can work very well to get the moderate quality feed for those animals. Like I said before, these crops require quite a bit of warm weather to grow them in fairly dry conditions. They do not tolerate very wet soils, but they will be very drought resistant. So if you do have a bout of drier weather, they can definitely do very well in those type of conditions. Within these different sorghum forages, there's lots of different traits. So we have the brown midrib trait. I think most people are familiar with that. It's reduced lignin content to improve the fiber digestibility. Then we have the brachytic dwarf. That's a shorter internode space between the leaves, so you get a shorter plant and a bit less possibility of lodging with those. Dry stalk, you have about 5% less moisture in those stalks, so it makes it a little bit quicker harvest time in the fall. Photoperiod sensitive, those types, that trait that's a trait in the plant that doesn't allow that plant to become reproductive until the daylight hours get less than about 12.5 hours. So it stays vegetative the entire growing season, so that it doesn't become reproductive. So your tonnage potential can be very high with that trait. Problem is getting it dry enough in this area in the fall can be a big challenge, and then lodging can become an issue with frost, just from experience. And then male sterols, it's a trait that obviously the pollen is not as sterile, so that it won't produce any grain with those types. So if you're looking for heifer feed, that would be a good option as well. Just some management that's really critical for sorghum forages. First and foremost is planting temperature of the soil. Really ideally it should be at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, at a minimum 60 degrees. If it's below that, it's really slow to germinate and come up, and you end up with a weed patch. So definitely you need to make sure those soil temperatures are at that. And then also it has to be a drier soil too. You do not want a fairly wet soil for growing these. Depth at planting, about 3/4 to 1 inch depth. In a heavier soils, the more sandy soils we can plant, we have a little bit more forgiveness at about 1 to 1.5 inches. As far as seeding rates, forage sorghums can be planted at fairly low seeding rates at about 60 to 80,000 seeds per acre. And you want it in wide rows at about 15 to 30 inch rows. Ideally, a planter would be really ideal for this situation, to plant that low of a seeding rate. Otherwise, a grain drill can work if you have it well calibrated. Sorghum sudan grass is a heavier seeding rate, 15 to 20 pounds with a grain drill is what should be used. And that depends upon what you anticipate to manage it for harvest. For a multi-harvest system, you'd put it in at narrow rows at 6 or 7 inch rows. If you're looking at a single harvest system, you really want to look at a wider spacing to allow more airflow through that field to let it dry later in the season. Just going through the harvest strategies. For multiple harvests, we want to be planting, typically we're going to be planting these in early to mid-June, again, depending on soil and temperature and moisture. We're typically going to get a first cutting within 40 to 45 days, which will be in late July or early August. And you're going to want to be looking at that at about 30 to 40 inches to really get high quality forage for lactating cows. That second harvest, really have two different options. You can either take that in early to mid-September and cut and wilt that to dry it, or you can let that freeze dry in mid to late October, and then you can come back and direct chop that off. And with that second option, when you do a freeze drying, you definitely have to wait at least 7 to 10 days for that to just dry, and plus also to dissipate any prussic acid that's in the leaves. With this system, that first cutting really needs to be at, we're thinking at least 6 inches of stem height. You want to leave so that you have some residual stem there for quicker regrowth, and you want to wide swath that to dry it quickly, and then crimp those stems to get that to dry, because it is a very wet crop that it'll take at least a few days to dry. As for a single harvest system, this really maximizes your yield. Typically, it's going to be almost 2 times the yield of a multi-harvest system. Typically, if we plant this in early to mid-June, that forage will be ready to direct harvest by mid-October, just based on maturity and dry down. If you get it planted later, say in late June, early July, you're gonna have to freeze dry that, because it's just not gonna reach a maturity to signal for it to dry down. So you can either, if you get in that situation, you can cut that in mid to late September if you don't want to have to deal with that thought of trying to freeze dry it. So this is a picture here that we planted it in on the 4th of July in Marshfield, and then cut it and wilted it and chopped it. If you get it planted on time, you can definitely be cutting this in that mid to late October time frame and it's going to be at that 30 to 40% dry matter. If it gets frosted, again, you're going to have to wait 7 to 10 days for those leaves to completely dry to dissipate that prussic acid. As far as looking at yields for sorghum forages, so again, the single harvest system, the orange bars are going to be quite a bit higher, 1.5 to 2 times the yield of a multi-harvest system. Typically, at least in central Wisconsin, we're getting 6 to 8 tons of dry matter, possibly higher in a really good year, and depending on soil moisture. It does really well on sand. It doesn't do as well in wetter conditions. So in Marshfield, we're going to get 5 to 6 tons of dry matter per acre in these systems. In a sandier soil, we've been getting 7, 8, 9 tons of dry matter per acre. If we look at the multi-harvest system, the blue bars, typical ranges are going to be 3 to 5 tons of dry matter in our 2 cutting system that we've been using. We've been seeing with these, and again, if you're using a multi-harvest system, I generally are going to recommend to use a sorghum Sudan grass or a Sudan grass. It just has better regrowth potential than, say, forage sorghums. And if you're looking for lactating cows, definitely need to go with the BMR with that higher fiber digestibility. And this shows that the forage quality protein typically is going to be 10 to 13% protein in a multi-harvest system. Single harvest is going to be fairly close to corn silage at 5 to 7 or 8% protein. NDF is very typically in that 55 to 65% NDF range for both multi-harvest and single harvest. You might get a little bit of dilution effect in these forage sorghums due to grain, but not as much as, say, corn silage. You're not going to get the grain development or starch content in these forage sorghums. Typically, you might get 15 to 20% starch at most in these single harvest forage sorghums. Where these forages really come in to play is this NDF digestibility, especially the BMRs. So these are 48 hours NDF digestibilities, and we're approaching about 70% NDF digestibility for BMR types, compared to the conventionals are only about 60, 65 in the multi-harvest. Within the single harvest, we get a little bit of a decrease, but still very good fiber digestibility of these single harvest forage sorghum or sorghum Sudan grass at about right around 60% NDF digestibility at 48 hours. So that's really where most of our energy is coming from. This is from NDF and also from sugars. The sugar content can be very high, of between 5 to 15% sugars in these crops. There are some special considerations with these, so nitrates and prussic acid, especially if you need to frost dry these. Nitrates will accumulate in the lower stem, and generally these won't dissipate after they're frosted, because the plant really never becomes active again to convert those nitrates to amino acids. So generally they're not going to dissipate. So you're going to probably want to raise the cutting height a bit to try to reduce those. Also, you need to make sure you fully ferment these in the silo, which you'll get a decrease of about 30 to 50% of the nitrates will be converted over to ammonia. Also, it's very high and can be very high in younger vegetative forage. So when you will freeze dry a multi-harvest system in the fall, the nitrates can become very high in those. As far as prussic acid, these generally accumulates in the leaves, and as long as you let that dry for 7 to 10 days and those leaves are completely brown and dry, that prussic acid levels will be very much reduced. Lastly, the potassium levels can be very high on these as well, especially in the multi-harvest system. So you definitely want to do a wet chemistry test for minerals on these forages to check for that. And generally, if it's high potassium, you're probably not going to want to feed these to dry cows, or at least close-up dry cows. I guess with that completes my part of it. So if you have any questions, you can email me, and I'll turn this over to Liz again.
Yep, and Matt, we did have a question come in over the chat, and the question is, which forage crop or crops are ideal following small grain summer harvest?
So if they're late summer harvest, like a grain harvest, like if a wheat harvest, is that what they're saying?
It doesn't specify. So this came from Josh Camps in the southern part of the state.
So if it's a cereal grain, like a grain harvest for wheat in late July, that's where the fall oats can come in really and play really well. You can put those in early August and get a good amount of yield with that by late September, early October. So
there's another question here. What's the best forage sorghum type for beef cattle? I think that's maybe more of Matt, what you cover.
yeah, I can try to get that. So it depends on how they want to manage it. If they're looking for more quality for young stock, you probably want to do a sorghum Sudan grass multi-cut. For beef cattle for overwintering, pretty low in protein requirements. If you needed more tonnage, you could go with more of a single cut system. That's what I would probably go with. If it depends on what they're feeding, I guess, is the main thing to consider. So.
Yeah, the sorghum Sudan, probably like Matt mentioned, will allow you the multi-cut as long as you don't let it head out. So it's a good strategy for beef operations, and you can have that kind of like slow supply, with the multi-cutting, as long as you don't let it head out. It heads out and it's game over.